This for reasons that have to do with global macro concerns as well as concerns about the welfare of individuals and families. In other words, I want now to try to answer the question with which this series of lectures began. Is population still an important global issue? And if so, what interventions are compatible with today's development thinking? Let me begin by saying that I want to treat the term population as signifying both rapid population growth as it refers to countries and as high fertility as it applies to individuals. I believe that countries that experience rapid population growth would be better off if the growth rate were moderated, and I believe that individuals, particularly poor people who have high fertility as the result of unplanned or unintended pregnancies, would be better off if their fertility were lower. By rapid population growth, I mean rates of natural increase over 2% per year, and by high fertility, I mean total fertility rates of over 3 children per woman. Generally speaking, countries with rates of natural increase over 2 have considerable difficulty keeping pace with the demand for jobs, the need to build classrooms and train teachers, the need for health facilities, the ability to produce sufficient food to meet domestic caloric and nutritional requirements, and the ability to invest resources in ways that promote economic growth. Research in recent years has clearly shown that reducing population growth rates provides countries with a window of opportunity, also known as a demographic bonus. This happens when fewer births results in a smaller dependent population, particularly of children under age 15, and a larger workforce relative to the dependent population. If countries invest wisely and appropriately, as the Asian tigers did during the 1960s and 1970s, they can take advantage of this one-time bonus to catapult themselves to considerably higher levels of productivity and growth, thus initiating a self-sustaining path to prosperity. Other countries which have experienced and cashed in on this bonus include Brazil and Chile, and today undoubtedly China and India. In other words, reducing fertility is by no means a sufficient condition for economic growth, but it may be a necessary one. I'm not aware of any country experiencing rapid population growth, as I have defined it, that has enjoyed rapid or sustained economic growth, except a handful of states whose wealth is the result of extensive petroleum exports. Furthermore, once the process begins, it becomes something of a virtuous circle. The better countries do economically, the lower fertility falls, thus mutually reinforcing, up to a point, the growth and prosperity processes. Many of you must have read last week's Economist magazine cover story. They did an excellent job, I think, of explaining this interaction of demography and economics. If you haven't, I commend it to you, and I gather there are copies available on the table over there. I should add that what happens at the end of this process, when, as is now the case across Europe and much of East Asia, fertility remains stubbornly below replacement, is the subject for an entirely separate lecture series. There was not always academic consensus on the relationship between population growth and economic development, and there may not even be consensus today, but the research findings I've just described are now widely accepted by development economists, and there is certainly broader agreement today than at any point since the 1970s. Staying for the moment at the macro level, there is also increasing agreement that high rates of population growth can have significantly negative consequences for the environment. The data are far from conclusive on such matters as climate change and global warming. Certainly, the interplay of sheer human numbers and consumption patterns must be acknowledged and better understood, but there is growing evidence that the relationship is real and that it is important. There's far greater consensus among scientists on the impact of rapid population growth on such issues as fresh water supplies, deforestation, soil erosion and depletion, biological diversity and species extinction, and air and water pollution. Other things equal, rapid population growth clearly makes it harder for countries to protect and preserve their natural environments and habitats. Finally, at the societal level, there is the issue of civil unrest and disruption. A rapidly growing population of poorly fed, poorly educated, and unemployed young people, especially young men, is a recipe for civil disorder born out of frustration and despair. Such young people are natural and willing recruits to radical political movements or simply violent manifestations of social collapse. One need look no further than the high fertility regions of the Middle East or much of East, Central, and West Africa to find countries which either are experiencing or have recently known political violence and social upheaval. I believe it's naive to think that high fertility and youthful age structures have nothing to do with this. For many years, economists looked at the high fertility of poor people and said that it was a natural response to poverty. Poor people with few resources, other than children, needed those children as a source of labor and old age security. The costs of children in a subsistence environment were relatively low, and their contributions to household well-being were significant. More recently, thinking about this relationship has changed. First, we have discovered that a great deal of childbearing of poor people, especially women, is unintended and unwanted. Seeing children as a net resource is a distinctly male construct. 30 years of household-level surveys in scores of nations have now shown us extremely high levels of unmet need for contraception, which, if satisfied, would result in considerably lower fertility, by as much as a whole child in much of Africa. Furthermore, researchers are increasingly documenting that families that successfully reduce fertility do considerably better economically on average than families that don't. In empirical studies in places as diverse as rural Bangladesh and urban Brazil, economic researchers find that lower fertility results in higher household incomes and overall living standards. Looking in particular at the Bangladesh findings, which are based on 2 decades of data from a true experiment, the MATLAB experiment, it is strikingly clear that families in the program villages, that is the experimental villages, who received family planning services and used them to limit their fertility, have done considerably better in terms of their incomes and overall living standards than families in the so-called control villages, where family planning services were not available. In other words, if one looks at the impact of fertility on poverty, rather than at the impact of poverty on fertility, it leads to quite different conclusions. Poverty reduction, of course, lies at the heart of the Millennium Development Goals. But no matter which of the MDGs one examines, education, child health, maternal health, HIV/AIDS, gender equality, food security, the relationship with fertility is clear and direct. I've already mentioned how rapid population growth makes it harder for governments to provide educational and health facilities. High fertility makes it harder for families to send all their kids to school, much less to get them immunized or properly cared for when they are sick and need medicine. A child born into a family of 3 or more children, especially if the birth comes less than 24 months after the last child was born, is much more likely to die before the age of 5 than a child born into a smaller family and 3 or more years after the last one. In other words, the number and spacing of children is critical to child survival. A mother who delays childbearing until her late 20s and who stops before she reaches her 40s is far likelier to survive to old age than a mother who starts sooner or ends later. Also, the fewer the births, the higher the chances of avoiding premature death. Women who marry later, delay childbearing, and have fewer children are far more likely to find work outside the home and contribute to household income and quality of life. They are more likely to get a decent education and to participate on more equal terms in family decision-making. And that goes for better educated men too. And of course, no factor is more important than female education when it comes to reducing fertility. Female education and reduced fertility may be the best example of mutually reinforcing outcomes in the entire literature of development.